All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Jason Snyder, who is a professor at the Department of Sustainable Development at ASU, that's Appalachian State University. He works in international food systems and development. And he got his, well, tell us where you got your PhD, from Michigan State University, right?
Yes.
Agricultural, food, resource economics, really awesome, necessary stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for the introduction.
Of course.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll caveat it a little bit. So yes, everything you said is mostly, true in the letter, but so I did get my PhD from Michigan State University, and for my dissertation, I studied like food supply chains, food systems in East Africa. And I was doing related work for my postdoc, more at the farm level stuff. And now I'm at Appalachian State, like I said. Right now, I'm actually just working as an adjunct faculty. My wife actually got a tenure track position here. But I'm also reorienting my priorities a bit. I'm becoming more and more interested in, I guess you would say, regenerative food systems, economics,
right?
Things of that nature. Other people have spoken of things like fractal localism, things of that nature. And so I'm kind of shifting my priorities, and so that's the only reason why I'm kind of, caveating is just not to give the wrong impression.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You and your wife, yeah, and you've got a 2-year-old now, right? Or
yes,
that's awesome.
Yeah, no, he's turned 2 December, and yeah, he's great. He's a handful, as every parent of a 2-year-old says, of course.
Absolutely, I'm sure. So you and your wife, you're both in academia. Is that how you two met?
Well, we met like in undergrad a long time ago. We met like 14 or 15 years ago. We've been married for like 13 years. So yeah, so you can say academia, but it was actually, we were both at the time part of the Baha'i faith.
Right.
Not anymore, but that we actually met in the Baha'i community, but we were both going to the same university at the time.
Right. It's really interesting. So we're just going to jump into that. I mean, that it so immeasurably shapes your own podcast, which of course I'll link to, the Both and podcast. In your inaugural episode of that, you and of course Jared Janes were discussing your backgrounds, and you make it a priority to mention that you grew up in the Baha'i faith, and so you developed this interest in self-inquiry and meditation that followed, and maybe you left the Baha'i faith, but that residue of that provided the impetus for a lot of further investigation into meditation.
Yeah. I mean, it's no doubt. It's had a huge influence on me. I mean, my influence, my religious background goes further than that. I also grew up in the, around in the Native American church. My dad was part of that. My mom became a Baha'i, and but I became a Baha'i, seriously in college. After, as a teenager, I was, taking, drugs and psychedelics and just kind of like exploring consciousness and meditating. And then I was like, okay, I need to like get serious with the system. And that happened to be the Baha'i faith. And I was a pretty hardcore Baha'i for like 8 years. I mean, up to, at a certain point I was like going door to door teaching the Baha'i faith. Like I was pretty serious about it.
Right.
But there was also a lot of, I mean, we can get into why I stopped being a Baha'i, but
sure.
All that is to say is that it's had a profound influence on me. As far as religions go, it's probably still my favorite.
Right.
I really admire and respect it, but I just, for multiple reasons, I couldn't be a Baha'i anymore. And then I got back into meditation later, after I stopped being a Baha'i for a while. And that's, been for the last 5 or 6 years, that's really been my path, but that's evolved as well.
That's awesome. Maybe you could give us a brief little sketch of why you left that faith, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe to start with, I'll just give a really brief outline of.
Sure.
A lot of people aren't familiar with it. So it's a religion that started in the mid 1800s in Persia, which is modern day Iran. And it was kind of, I think, mostly influenced by Shiite Islam, but it became kind of an independent religion. And there was two prophet founders, but the main one, who went by the name of Baha'u'llah, he basically proclaimed himself to be the promised one of all of the religions, and that this was the day of basically the kingdom of God being built on earth, right? But there's a kind of a central concept in the Baha'i faith called progressive revelation, which is basically states that, you know, God has been with humanity for all time, even pre-human, before the, you know, metaphorical Adam, but has revealed itself or himself or herself in many different forms to many different people, both appropriate to the cultural context, but also to the kind of the level of cultural and cognitive evolution. And so that's why, you know, according to the Baha'i faith, that's why these religions might seem so different, is because they were meeting the needs of the age. But they all kind of had this, you know, what was called a manifestation of God. And it's all kind of leading up to this kind of seminal moment of basically, you know, the nature of today is the unity of humankind. And, you know, many other things, but that's kind of like the kernel. And so that's, you know, and that was really, you know, that was when I was growing up. I mean, that was really far out for me. I was like, yeah, this is great. In terms of why I stopped being a Baha'i, I mean, there's a number of reasons. One is that I just started becoming really skeptical of kind of a religious ontology of the world, so to speak. You know, I started seeing kind of the evolution of, you know, humans in more of our, I guess, a Darwinian sense, and not so much in like a divine revelation sense. So I was like, okay, well, you can kind of explain these prophets by the cultural conditions of the time, and it would make sense that, you know, a religion would arise because it was, you know, evolutionarily adaptive, you know, for the culture. It was culturally adaptive. And so I started taking more of like a sociological or anthropological lens on things. And so I kind of just lost my faith.
Okay.
There were some other things like, you know, so while it's kind of very socially, I would say, progressive, it's also very kind of, in terms of like personal morality, it's very conservative, right? So there's like no drugs, no drinking, no sex before marriage, you know, and also, you know, their position on like gay marriage or homosexuality is not very progressive. And all of those things I was just kind of, you know, like, you know, I personally, I was like, well, this is just not really aligning with my interests or my values anymore. But I think the core thing was I just kind of lost my faith. But that is all to say, I still think I have a religious sensibility. You know, I really love religious texts. I really resonate with religious language, but I have a different relation to it now than I did, you know, as a zealous, you know, 20-something.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of gone to an appreciation instead of an adherence.
Yeah. It's definitely an appreciation. And I think the Baha'i community, I mean, there's a lot going forward in terms of how they organize themselves. You know, on the one hand, or in one sense, is very democratic, where each community elects an assembly through a very kind of, you know, good democratic process, and then the national level and international level, it kind of does that as well. And I think there's a lot that people can learn from the Baha'i teachings, and also Baha'i kind of political organization and all of that.
Right.
And so I still draw from it. And to be honest, you know, a lot of my worldview today and what I talk about is still, you know, really informed by the basic, you know, kind of sensibility and vision of the Baha'i faith. So, you know, I have to give credit where credit's due.
So to give listeners a little bit of a background, I kind of found your work through, obviously, Twitter. That's how we connected. There was a lot of overlap, the different kind of communities, especially when it comes to the philosophical side of Twitter, which I definitely dipped into quite a bit. It's a little heavier thinking than a lot of psychology Twitter, to be honest with you. And I think anybody involved in the field of psychology needs to have a good grounding in phenomenological philosophy, different So especially the embodied cognition stuff. That's what I've studied. And we'll get into it a little bit.
Yeah.
We'll get into a lot actually, but
I love that topic. So
yeah, no. And that is what, so even the title of your podcast, Both And, gets into this therapeutic stance of what we call dialectical behavior therapy. Are you familiar with it at all?
So I'm not familiar with that term,
right.
but I'm kind of one of those people who I don't really know much of the terminology of the field of psychology, but when people start explaining the ideas, I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm familiar with that.
Well, I'm sure you will be, because the dialectical behavior therapy, this dialectical stance, is taking two ideas that people usually hold in opposition, like wanting to change versus self-acceptance, or recognizing something sucks, but also accepting it. And so there's that dialectic, that tension, which in philosophy, of course, you know more about dialectics than in psychology, because we have the Hegelian dialectic, we have dialectical materialism, in Marxism, we have all these different schools of thought that have these thesis, antithesis, and then a synthesis, right? Well, so what psychology does in an applied sense is use these ideas for this particular therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. And it's for people who have, and we'll get into, I really wanted to get into all of the interesting embodied ramifications of this, but it's a therapy that really involves this term called radical acceptance of opposing dialectics and synthesizing them, right? And so all of the stuff that you talk about with Jared, like especially in your most recent episode, or not your, excuse me, the most recent one you had a guest, but the Q&A one, you guys really delved into that, and I took a lot of notes. So that's the next to most. I'll link to it in the description. But and then the first one where you laid out your mission to be a cartographer for the mimetic tribes, all of that stuff gets into looking at synthesizing these things that people may find less than open to it.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
Well, I mean, that description really resonates with me. A big theme in my life in, the last few years is that I went through a period, when I was a Baha'i, but also after I was a Baha'i, of this kind of extreme cognitive dissonance.
Sure.
And, I can get into all of the details if you want, but I basically, through my contemplative practice, it basically allowed me to hold contradictory ideas in my mind and to not have to kind of freak out because there was like two different paradigms in my mind that seemed kind of mutually contradictory. A big part of contemplative practice is allowing thoughts just kind of be there and provide a space for them. And then to kind of like feel in your body. It's like, well, why is this idea so threatening, right? Well, it's creating some tension in my body. Well, maybe I can just pay attention to body sensations. And by doing that, you're creating this space, and, it kind of allows this slow synthesis, but not, while also not, not chasing, not running into these paradoxes and, banging your head against the wall over and over. Right. And so what you're describing in that therapy actually sounds, kind of what I did in a very unprofessional, in a very undirected sense, but it resonates with me. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because you encountered it then in the purest sense, because Marsha Linehan, the creator of DBT, was someone who suffered from, well, she's not dead, but she doesn't suffer from anymore, borderline personality disorder. So that personality disorder involves real cognitive fusion with your beliefs that arise from really intense sensations. And so I'll link in the description to the episodes that you really get into this stuff, because if people want to understand the underpinnings for how to do self-inquiry and meditation and stop imbibing, or rather stop going off of these sort of different narratives that they've ingested either from the outside world or from the bottom up from a very sensitive nervous system, there's plenty of material there. And so you came to it through self-discovery, which is really worth a lot more than being spoon-fed it, because I mean, we obviously know when somebody tells you something or commands you to do something, the impulse is to do the opposite. So when you discover it on your own, there's a real sacred value to that. But DBT, what's interesting is you laid out in that Q&A episode your own view of what the best kind of selfhood is. And you use the metaphor of a cell. And for the listeners out there, you use the metaphor that a cell that has no contact with the outside world turns cancerous, but then one that has no boundary. Okay, so the cancerous one, the one with too big a boundary, kind of turns into something pathological, right? And we can look at people who are very, very self-contained and reclusive and are paranoid, and we can see that implosion. But then you see the other, and that I conceptualize that as the disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, where you are everything, right? And there's a toxicity from within because no outside information is getting in. And so my mind went wild with this stuff because I use these metaphors like personality disorders are an autoimmune disorder of the mind because your own thoughts are tearing you up. And it's these metaphors are amazing. So
no, I love that metaphor that you just put out there.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, it's very similar. Again, it's so fascinating. We're in different fields and we're coming to these same things in different terms. And then especially that converse of if you have no boundary, you end up a diffuse kind of, I think you said you're in the ocean and you become the ocean. You don't have any boundary to keep you from from dissolve into it. And it's like, well, that automatically to me sounds like the codependent personality disorder and other disorders of having no self. And we can look at people who are very dependent or who have nothing holding them. And like, that's very dangerous as well, because people who are empathic usually get exploited in that way. And they're kind of like a husk that there's whatever anyone wants them to take on, they can become, and it's very exhausting.
Yeah.
And so you lay out masterfully this way of looking at meditation that can benefit whether someone's on the severe end of self-obsession or of literal selflessness.
Right. Yeah. No, this is a very rich topic. One framework. So the metaphor of the cell, I actually got that metaphor. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with the enactivist literature.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fanboy of enactivism. But so the process of a cell, both kind of maintaining its own internal structure and its own kind of self repair mechanisms, but also receiving, but balancing that with receiving signals and, you know, and from the outside, is called autopoiesis. And so that, and I love that term, that metaphor. I encourage people to look it up. But I do think it applies, you know, at many scales, including as you're hinting at, you know, at our kind of individual body mind system, right? What we consider ourselves. It's a very, so, you know, there's many kind of mode you can work in, and this I actually get into. I wrote an article a while back talking about integrating mindfulness and self-inquiry, but I guess. To summarize, is that having these no self or kind of non-dual experiences, I feel like can be very valuable, but they need to happen within a certain context, within a certain set and setting, so to speak.
Right.
Where, you know, like you want to be in a almost like in a ritual environment where like you're going through this process of, you know, kind of this self-transcendence process in a space where, one, you're not going to be taken advantage of, right?
Absolutely.
A lot of problems with that, with like, you know, you mentioned abuse with, you know, in the psychotherapy field, and I'm not familiar with that at all, but I'm more familiar with like the abuse in like the guru scene, right? Like the
very similar, let's just say.
Right. So having going to these extremes can be useful, but you have to have the right context for them in order to be able to integrate the lessons you learn from that later, right?
Right.
In order to have this more balanced, or I actually like the term dynamic more than balanced, because balance almost implies some kind of stasis.
Right.
So it's like the dynamic, you know, and part of what self-inquiry is about is, at least how I define it and how I lay it out, is that, you know, you're constantly exploring different perspectives on the self from many different angles. So you can do it like the kind of the traditional self-inquiry is, who am I, or what is aware,
right,
or who hears, or who is seeing. So these questions, but then you can also explore with a sense of self-ownership, agency, like really strongly, like this is my experience, like I am looking, this, I am having this experience, it's mine, and actually feel what that feels like in the body, to really
right,
feel this sense of ownership, right? Or you can do the opposite of like, there is nobody looking, there is nobody here. It's
right.
almost like extreme disassociation. And what does that feel like? And my kind of idea is, as long as you're creating the right setting, and for many people, having a trusted teacher or therapist or companion to guide them through this process is important. For me, I'm very DIY, so I kind of just went through this myself and made some mistakes. And I had one teacher, but it didn't turn out well. But
Sure.
having these like exploring the boundaries and the edges can be really fruitful, as long as you do it in the right way.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And the abuse in the therapeutic field really gets into things like, I had a podcast recently with a YouTuber who covers a lot of female-led sexual abuse, like female teachers who typically have sexual relations with underage male students. And so we got into kind of psychology of that, and we got into that when she was speaking to someone about, like, it could be secondhand trauma, or it could be traumatizing to see negative videos, because people were sending her stuff to do reports on. The psychiatrist said, oh no, that couldn't be it. And the thought is, well, why wouldn't watching videos of mass shootings be psychologically distressing? And so there's a lot of kind of diminishment and dismissal of what constitutes trauma. And not everything isn't trauma, right? We know that. We know that there's a real lack of resilience today. And that's a whole different topic, which really dovetails nicely with examining oneself, because the fragile self will break, but it does give way to something else. But the abuse in the therapeutic community comes from, I think, therapists who are occupying this sort of ego state, which we'll talk about ego states, kind of like a role, a very flimsy role as therapists in quotes. And then what happens is, like, when that gives way and breaks, there's this lack of professionalism. I mean, therapists can talk about themselves too much, which I wouldn't have even believed is as big an issue as it is, because that's just therapy 101. You focus on the client. But if you're adopting a role and you're kind of a character rather than first internalizing the values, then there's a real problem. And so people like you, who spend your time actually living the experience of this stuff, believe it from the inside out. If you go to, it's like becoming a priest. It's like you can study theology and then be a horrible person. As a therapist, you can study, because therapy, psychotherapy is really like it's like a meta frame that we have. It's a meta narrative. But then it's such a fascinating topic, because if you're playing a role and you don't believe this stuff, then there's bound to be some real hurt when anything nicks the surface of that role.
Right. Yeah.
Which gets into Keegan's stuff, right? It's like you have these things, like if you're not level 4, which again, I'll link to that for people to keep up with. But if you're not like a level 4 where you look at systems, and you're a level 3 and you're enmeshed in your relationships, then there's going to be some problems when you are supposed to be at a system level as a therapist, helping people look at their relationships rather than being enmeshed in relationships yourself.
Right. That's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about this idea of, if the therapist is in a Kagan stage 3, which is, you're defined by your relationships.
Right.
And, there's not kind of a larger logic to, this relationship, this part of the relationship might make me feel bad, but it's actually a necessary medicine, or, but if it's just like kind of this just give and take without any logic to it, I can see as a therapist, if you're in that state, it can get really manipulative really quickly. Yeah.
Well, and you can take offense to things. So as a therapist, if you're stage 4, you realize that in the relationship you have with a client, when you bring up stuff that's challenging, that they're paying you for, but that they still maybe not like, they might not like to hear. You can't take it personally. You have to let it hit your role. You have to let it bounce off, like you're imagining the role of therapist is taking this offense that you would otherwise take personally.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of all this stuff with your podcast. I mean, really, the food for thought that it generates in me, and I'm sure the other listeners, is spectacular because it's just all ideas. What you and Jared get into. So, which a big one. So let me. The article you're talking about, is it your decentralizing cognition article? Because I was just reading that before I was brushing up on it today before getting on the podcast here with you, because you talk about you felt you could adopt multiple selves based on situation. I love that because people really have to break through to that. A popular, I don't know if you get this, but a popular kind of refrain or objection would be, isn't that multiple personalities? Do you ever get that from people when you talk about this if they're uninitiated?
Yeah, well, I think that's a natural that's a natural question,
right?
And I think the key the key thing that differentiates it, at least in my mind, from multiple personality disorder, is that there is a level of meta awareness of what's happening. So when I say I feel like I can adopt multiple selves, I can, take on the role of saying, now I'm a parent, and I can feel like a parent, like I'm a father, and I'm not, and I'm going to take that role and even that identity seriously. Right. Or if I'm, in a contemplative practice and I'm having this kind of non-dual experience, I'm taking that seriously, but there also needs to develop, when you're experimenting with these practices that take on different identities, of this kind of, Kuladasa, this teacher, John Yates, who's a really influential teacher of mine. Okay. He talks about metacognitive awareness, right? Yes. And it's basically this kind of witness consciousness that allows you to observe the process as it's happening and kind of provide some guardrails, right? So, it's like if I'm taking on my identity as a parent and maybe I'm taking myself too seriously, right? And I need to lighten up, that metacognitive awareness can notice that and be like, okay, time to recalibrate. Yeah. And so there is that kind of this coordinating function that arises. And I think, meditation, mindfulness is a great way to develop that function, because mindfulness is all about observing your moment-to-moment experience, your phenomenology as it's arising, and notice thoughts, come in, move away, not chasing them, noticing how they're related to your body, your feelings, your body sensations, your moods, and just noticing the whole system. And it's almost like a muscle that you develop, this metacognitive awareness. Right. And so, I wouldn't, I would probably advise people to develop this mindfulness, ability first before you start really experimenting with this, kind of self-inquiry and trying to embody, different parts of yourself, at least really strongly, right? You can kind of do both, like a feedback loop and, go back and forth, but you definitely shouldn't have the latter without the former.
I agree with that. And it's funny, again, because the DBT modules start with mindfulness, and they get into distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and then finally interpersonal effectiveness, which, you can kind of see the progression there where you learn these skills. And then at the end is the test where you implement them on an interpersonal basis, which I think is the healthiest way to go. Yeah. Hearing you discuss mindfulness and the metacognition as a muscle, I use the metaphor with clients a lot. It's like one of the most common things you get when somebody wants either spiritual or mental help or whatever is, okay, I'm here, fix me. It's the medical model of I need medication, which medication is definitely essential in some conditions. I'm not an anti-meds person. That would be obscenely irresponsible. Yeah, however, even medication, the metaphor doesn't work magically because, as we know, antidepressants and other medications take days to weeks to work, to build up that half-life, right? To build up the steady state. So when people come to therapy or when they start practicing this stuff that you discuss, there has to be the awareness that it is building up a muscle. And just like that, you don't expect to go on a magical stream entering moment the first time you do it. You shouldn't, right? You shouldn't expect to lift 300 to bench 300 pounds when you go and you've never worked out. No one expects that with physical weights because you can see. But spiritual weights and mental weights, people do tend to have the idea that if they're not doing it right, if they're not doing mindfulness right, oh, well, screw that. Let me go back to being enmeshed with my own ego.
Yeah. No, I think that's a perfect analogy of the weightlifting, right? And it's almost not an analogy because you are, in contemplative practice, you are changing your brain, right?
Absolutely.
You know about neuroplasticity and things of that
100%.
sort. So it's almost not even an analogy, but it is it is an analogy, I guess. But yeah, I mean, you don't go to the gym and try and bench press. I don't know. I used to work out a lot, but I haven't been in the gym for a while. But whatever's a lot for bench pressing, right? 300 pounds,
yeah.
200 pounds. I don't know. You start with the light weights and you work your way up, and it's the exact same thing. But that said, I do think, at least for me, my system, I definitely don't think is a universal system. It's I'm very DIY, and so I kind of pieced it together from many other systems that I was exploring. But I feel like at least for me, for my system, I've found ways to hack the process to make it work a little bit faster. Nothing magic, but to kind of to speed it up, at least for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's really relevant to share. And again, I think people have to experiment, even when they're using directions or even when they're listening to something. They have to find what works out of that. So that's a huge point. Yeah,
and following your intuition is important. So I mean, one thing that I ran into when I was starting to follow different, say, meditation teacher instructions,
right?
Following their instructions, and my intuition was telling me to do something slightly different. And I developed this whole complex of no, I need to stick to the instructions, but and then I deviate, and it felt really good, but then I felt guilty. It was just not a good dynamic, psychological dynamic. And I guess for someone starting out with meditation, my advice would be start with the system. You need to start somewhere, some a book or a teacher or something. But if your intuition is leading you in a certain direction to a certain kind of technique or something in your how you control your attention and your awareness, follow it a little bit, see where it takes you, and start building trust in your intuition. I think that intuition is another thing. This gets into embodied cognition.
It does.
Is another thing that needs to be trained, right? We shouldn't, an untrained intuition, to say, just follow your intuition could lead you in a very bad direction because it might have been trained in a totally different context. And it might be kind of, and there might be some trauma in there. And so it might be kind of, and so you need to also train your intuition, your embodied cognition. I kind of use those interchangeably. And I think the kind of the metacognitive awareness, and even rationality, your rational prefrontal cortex functions, that's really useful in training your embodied cognition, but vice versa, right? Oftentimes we get too much in our heads, in our thinking process. We're chasing thoughts, and it's leading us into dead ends and stressing us out. And then we need to bring it to the body and re-tap into what we're actually feeling and sensing and intuiting.
Yeah. So that's a good jumping off point here, because as far as the embodied, well, let's just finally hit the embodied cognition thing, because I love it. So a good book that I encourage people to read is The Body Keeps the Score. It's a book about embodied cognition and its relationship to trauma. So an example of how that relates is people who were able to run away from the collapsing Twin Towers on 9/11, and they were able to escape, had a lower incidence of PTSD than people who were trapped where they were, which intuitively it's like the body, and I know this is a little different than what we're talking about with body cognition, but there's that, if you're able to run away and escape, your brain has the signal that you're safe and you were able to actually fight or flee, in this case, to flee.
Right.
So if your intuition gets hijacked by feelings of entrapment or things like that, that's something to recognize. That putting attention back in the body is helpful because physical sensation. So are you a proponent of, or are you familiar with the somatic marker hypothesis? Do you like Antonio Damasio at all?
I haven't. I have a Damasio book somewhere, but I haven't
The
read it.
Strange Order of Things is a good one
Okay.
by him.
Yeah, I think that might be the one I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read it though.
Yeah. Well, so you already
me-
know this stuff.
yeah.
Essentially, emotions and corresponding bodily changes are what we call somatic markers, and so they become associated with particular situations and past outcomes.
Yes.
So our somatic markers can send us into memories of past stuff. And so if you're noticing when you pay attention to your body that it's sending you back into trauma or forward into what ifs, which are shaped by trauma, it's fascinating. That part of meditation, that part of mindfulness, it really digs into the why we move toward or away from certain stimuli. And I think people can really underestimate how powerful it is.
Yeah.
The mindfulness, of the body. So when you talk about taking it back to physiology, I think, so that gets into another thing of ego state psychology. So an ego state is essentially a defense mechanism or a response that has become so embedded. It's a personality thing. So someone who, being a comedian is essentially an ego state because you're performing for laughs and you learn that was a good way to get attention. And that's a humorous defense mechanism. So that's a brilliant example of it. I don't think I can take credit for that. I think I heard that somewhere, but you get like people pleasers, and that's a state, like going into like the supplicating state. It's like I tell my clients, okay, when you start doing that and thinking I have to do this to get approval, what are you feeling first? What is going on in your body? And it's usually some like feeling in the throat or in the chest or like a drop, of kind of tension of if I don't do this, it's like a compulsion. Like if I don't do this, then something will happen. I will be abandoned. So I think your podcast really puts that in a conversational, really intellectual way, but in a philosophical and conversational way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, what you're describing there is really in line with kind of how I see things as well. And I resonate with it a lot. I mean, you can almost see it in how people hold themselves, right?
Yeah.
Like their posture, how they walk.
Right.
Like you can tell a lot about a person by how they walk.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, you absolutely can. Yeah.
And how, there's so many, and that's why, nonverbal cues and things of that nature are so interesting. And yeah, it really all relates to this notion that there's so much information that's in, when I say in the body, I'm not, it's also in the mind, of course, and the mind-body system is very interconnected. But, when you're, especially, when you're doing some kind of meditation and you're say exploring some tension somewhere or a sense of contraction, right? And you just pay attention to it, you notice it, and you might notice that it starts to open up a little bit, and all of a sudden, a lot of memories, like you said, like kind of memories of traumatic experience, emotions start arising. And that's kind of this example of how these are, like you said, the body keeps the score. That's a book I've been wanting to read, by the way, but from what people have described, I'm like, yeah, I'm nodding my head it's like all our life experience, cumulative life experiences, like our body keeps a record of that.
Right.
Especially if it's kind of if it was like we had to defend ourselves, some kind of defense mechanism, there's a sense of contraction, and it was to protect ourselves, but now we're in a new context, and that contraction, which has correlates to how we think about things, it almost like provides the range of what we can think about, right? And so when you're exploring these kind of tensions in your body, I tweeted a while back that you can kind of approach, if you're looking to do this in a contemplative way, to develop yourself, you can kind of approach it from a bottom up or a top down. So the top down would be basically you notice thoughts that might be disturbing or something, and then you trace where it is in the body that they're correlated to, and they're going to be correlated somewhere if you develop enough concentration and sensory clarity. Or you can just kind of start body scanning and notice, look, where's their tension, or it doesn't all have to be about tension, right? It can be about, that's really, maybe in my stomach, there's just this real nebulous feeling and it's kind of strange, but it's kind of intriguing. I don't know. and then notice what thoughts start arising as you pay
Right.
attention to those, parts of your body. And, it could be on the surface, but you can also go like, it's amazing how much we can feel in our body if we just pay attention, right? Like, for the audience, maybe a simple, a very easy entry here is just pay attention to your hands, like just the sensations in your hands. And you should find pretty quickly that you start feeling a lot of tingling. And, that's a good place to start. Also the feet. Oh, there's a lot stored in the feet, so be a little careful with the feet, because that's connected to many other parts of your body physiologically. And psychologically. And yeah, this is all connecting to this, this notion of embodied cognition, is that the mind body system is, completely integrated, right? Like you can't really talk about the body without talking about the mind, and vice versa. Right.
No, it's absolutely true. And so the mind body dualism was a huge issue.
Right.
We can't really underestimate that. I mean, it's been harped on a bunch. I mean, there's the book Descartes' Error, for God's sake. So Descartes really, like, brain in a jar, I think, therefore I am. I mean, that plays its part for sure. But the inactivist perspective is really the closest I think we have to really approximating reality at this point, because I mean, it's a huge pet peeve of mine when people have this sort of rational agent view, which is why I like how you highlight Keegan's stages of development. To kind of pivot into that for a moment, we can move between topics, but the reason that I love your fondness for Robert Keegan's theory of adult development is because there's that it contrasts with Kohlberg's model, which is that rational agent view. So we could get into that, like the whole pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional view of ethics, right? So it's like, fine, but where does the limbic system, where does the vagus nerve play into all that? Like those aren't really when your real ethical the judgment of your real ethics comes at what you do when you're really activated, you're in your nervous system, right? Because anyone can sit and think about what they would like to do.
Yeah, right.
And so it's really interesting. In your story about how you ended up talking to your co-host through finding stuff about Keegan online, you really took me back, because I learned about Keegan's model in my undergrad years in psychology, which the only reason to get an undergrad in psychology is if you want to be a therapist or a researcher, because it just gives you like the expanded universe of theorists out there that you can play with and maybe use as a dissertation. So Keegan's one of those who I glommed onto that because I was coming from a sort of evangelical background and then going into kind of a more emergent church sort of view. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's kind of like the postmodern church.
Is it similar to like process theology or something like that?
Yeah, it's very similar. It's just got more of a poetic bent, if you want to know the truth of it. Nice. So it's like you get into this whole, wait a minute, I'm in a system, and I can believe my system is true, and I can also see outside of, just very interesting things like that. That we miss when we kind of go through the. I mean, everybody knows the damn pyramid, okay? Maslow's hierarchy. Everybody knows that. And it's somewhat simplistic. I think these kind of models need to get some more public comprehension, because they're not that hard once you get a good heuristic of them, kind of shorthand. But it plays into embodiment, right? Because you get like, how much are you triggered by your relationships at level 3, where you're infused with them, and when you're fused and you get upset, you get outside what we call that window of tolerance, where you can't tolerate incoming stimuli, incoming emotion.
Right. Your full identity is tied to how you see yourself in relation to others and how you think they see you, and that's like the totality, or most of what your identity is composed of.
100%.
And in that state, just to riff off what you're saying, in that state, if there's any attack on your sense of standing in this network of relationships, that's a direct assault on your being. And so this kind of, you use this word tolerance, this, what was the phrase you used?
It's actually a psychology or neurology term, window of tolerance.
Okay.
It refers to how much you can take.
I like the term. Another term that's similar is affordance. Like, how much affordance do you have
yes. Okay.
to to observe how your identity is being formed moment to moment,
right,
subject to your relationships. Yeah.
Right. I love it. Yeah. So now that we're talking about it, it's like people who adhere to these, and I want to back up a little bit here, to the purpose of your podcast essentially is to be a mimetic mediator, right? Or is that's the term?
Yeah. And that's the term actually that was coined by Peter Limberg in his article with Connor Barnes, Culture Work 2.0. Yeah. And he's
say it again?
A friend of mine. He's a great guy.
Who was it?
Peter Limberg.
Yep. Just for everybody to hear. Yeah. I love him. I loved your podcast with him because he gets into his whole thing of if somebody fights with him on Twitter, he's like, oh, well, I'm not fused to this idea. Maybe they're right. Maybe I didn't get this right. I remember you saying he kind of got a cheeky, like, oh, my ideas are great.
Right.
But then,
performative agnostic is the term he uses, which I love.
What is it again? What agnostic?
A performative agnostic.
Okay. I love that. So you can think about this whole idea of mimetic tribes or people who are so enmeshed with their worldview. It's like, well, they're at a level 3 at most,
Not
right?
necessarily.
Would you say a level 4 for their system? They really think their system is the best.
It depends on if it's a identity-based tribe or if it's kind of an ideologically based tribe.
Well, they can't be at level 5 though.
Probably not.
Because that's like 1% from what I remember just reading. It's like, well, that's at that level.
I mean, it's hard to, the danger of these stage models, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, is, being too confident at what stage you are. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
And also being too confident at what stage you think other people are. But in terms of in terms of what we would call mimetic tribes, which, the basic idea behind that, is pretty simple. It's another way to put it is ideological tribes. And we see, like say on Twitter that there's these, people have been doing these clustering maps lately of like Twitter networks. And you see these clear clusters of groups that are different people, different ideas, but they kind of cluster together in kind of some kind of coherent ideology or some kind of coherent identity group. Right. And it can be a mixture of both as well, right? So it's not always clear cut. It can be a continuum. But yeah, the stage 4, at least in my understanding, would be more of like, it's a group defined by a set of philosophical principles would probably be more likely to be stage 4. Okay,
right. So the zealotry of ideas and
Yeah. So even, I'd say a lot of religious people, like say a pastor, or a priest is, it would probably, or even like say a military commander,
right,
who is like, I don't care about your feelings. Like this is the system and it works and we're going to follow the system.
Right.
That might be close to a stage 4 or, of course, that's not to say that, there's not shadow sides to each stage, right? So you can be too domineering or you can lack empathy or you can lack this, I think for me, at least from my perspective, a danger of stage 4 is that you become so ideological, like all of your relationships are managed by how you think the world should work, that you become too stoic or you become too disconnected from your emotions.
Right.
And just, I like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Ken Wilber and stuff. He talks a lot about like with these stage models is transcend and include. Right. Yeah. And so you don't give up the benefits of the previous stages, but it's just, you're adding something to it. And that's different than, transcend and don't include. And that has at least from my perspective, has a big shadow side.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, and to get in a little bit of evolutionary neurobiology or just evolutionary psychology in general, it's like, have you ever seen that movie Daybreakers? It's a really cheesy B movie.
I haven't, no.
Okay, so well, for anybody who hasn't watched it, sorry, I'm going to spoil it. There's at the end so it's about like everyone in the future is a vampire, right? Okay, and they're running out of humans. I didn't say it was a good movie. And they're running out of the blood supply. And so there's the serum that will turn people back into humans, okay? There's a real problem with that, though. It's because when they start giving it at the end, the people who turn to humans are relieved of that plight of being a vampire and just basically dying because there's no blood, but then they become food so they're at that level where they kind of have that illness taken out, but then they become food for the vampires. And so I always wonder with these models, when you reach this higher developmental level, it's like a society of people who are level 5 in a world of 3s. It's like human evolution. Like we are severely social and very embedded in that for a reason. So it's like if you have an epidemic situation and somebody is at a level 5 and they're responding very coolly, but maybe they don't survive because they're too, I mean, at a level 5, so what you're saying, like people have this conceptualization that developmental maturity is utter stoicism. And I like that you're going against that because you have this view, like in that situation, if that's it, then they're kind of like the sacrificial people who will be eaten alive because they don't have any of their will left, right? A lot of these models will say basically you're this angelic thing, like you have no self-preservation, you're disembodied, and maybe that's the ultimate goal in some schools of Buddhism. Another thought, I mean, there's so many different schools. It's a goal of one of them, I'm sure, and the inverse of another, I'm sure. But you get into this misconception that higher levels of development involve being defenseless, you're going against your imperatives,
right? And right. So I'm definitely, of the mind that you need to, you can have these kind of more, I guess you can say airy, you can like have these, again, non-dual experiences, or no self, or, or I'm fused with all living things. And that's wonderful stuff. But you need to reintegrate your embodied organism, right? And
100%.
You're situated in this, in your environment. An analogy that I really like to compare this to is the development of the brain, right? So the most recent development is the prefrontal cortex, but as I think many of us are realizing, that's like your rational mind, right? And it's great to have really develop that capacity. But if you're disconnected from, again, your body, your emotions, your embodied cognition, your intuition, then it's going to turn out, it's actually going to be very ineffective, and it's going to be, it's going to have a lot of problems with it. And so, so for me, it's like we still, are kind of, I don't know what this better than me. What's the part of the brain that's like one of the, like the brain stem that's we have in common with like lizards and
the brain stem, like absolutely. That's
like to me, like brain. That's all still valuable stuff, and we need the whole thing about development for me is you try and develop yourself, and there's many stage frameworks. Whatever you're using, you get to this higher stage, but you have to keep reintegrating the earlier stages and making this one kind of coherent unit, right? Like the brain is not, if the brain was disconnected, if the prefrontal cortex was completely disconnected from the brainstem or, earlier, brain development stages, you'd be completely dysfunctional. And I do not see that as a good thing.
nor would I. Right. It's interesting there. So I want to turn into meta-modernism here and pivot into that. Maybe discuss your conceptualization of it, if that's okay, and then talk about maybe anything you've learned along the way in your podcast that was surprising, or the kind of your overall assessment of the meta-modern state.
So maybe to give a little bit of background. So meta-modernism. So before I started learning about metamodernism, broadly defined, it's a lot of different things. I became very fascinated with integral and the work of Ken Wilber and the whole scene, movement that grew out of that. And, Wilber talks about not only, and this is relating to our earlier conversation, not only personal development stages, but cultural development stages, right? And so he talks about like I don't remember the exact order, but like the mythic, the archaic, the pre-Faustian, that might not be Wilbur's, that may be somebody else. But, you eventually get to like the kind of more traditional, you get to the modernist, you get to the postmodernist. They have this stage model of what they call spirodynamics, which is both kind of individual and societal developmental stages. And, they have like colors. And so, I've been reading, Wilbur since I was like 20. So that's all been percolating. But I first came across metamodernism through the books of this character that was created. Like, it's a fictional author called Hansi Franacht, and it's actually written by two different people. So there's a couple of books, the Listening Society and Nordic Ideology, which I would those are the two most influential books for me in the last couple of years, I would say. And there's a lot of similarities to Integral there, but just to kind of lay out what that's about. I mean, so it does place a lot of priority on the importance of personal development in developmental stages. It draws a lot upon Michael Common's model of hierarchical complexity. It draws upon all the models too. It gives nod to Kagan and other folks. But it basically lays out a vision of what you could say a relative utopia, not an absolute utopia, because that, those are dangerous and impossible, right? But like it's unabashedly laying out a vision for like a better society, right, and better people,
right?
And that, of course, that resonates with me because that's what the Baha'is do as well, and that's what Integral does as well. And it pairs it probably more than Integral does with kind of, where, kind of how we have to think about economics, how we have to think about politics. But it really focuses a lot on, especially this transition, from, relevant to our times, from what it calls, modernism, which is kind of, going back to Descartes and this, mind-body dualism and the scientific revolution. In many ways, these were all valuable things. But then it talks about, okay, what is postmodernism? Well, postmodernism is this kind of inherent critique of the grand narratives of modernism, right? And it says, well,
the meta narratives.
It starts taking a lens to the meta narratives behind modernism, and it basically argues that there's a lot of value coming out of that as well, right? Like postmodernism, for all its flaws today, and all its shadow sides we see with this kind of ultra woke culture and all the pathologies associated with that, but behind that, like there's a lot of important insights there, and one is that all narratives, like modernism took itself very seriously. Is like this, we're distinguishing ourselves from traditional religious worldview. The new salvation is the perfected man through science and technology, and postmodernism is like, well, but there's this huge shadow side, guys. Like, look at the history of colonialism, look at the history of slavery, look at, our environmental crisis, all of these things that postmodernism kind of gives you the tools to provide. But then what's kind of this Hansi character argues is that, well, now we need to get to the next stage. And the next stage is we've been deconstructing these narratives so long that we're in this kind of relativistic chaos where you don't know how to move forward. Like, yes, we've deconstructed all the systems, but where do you go from there? How do you envision a better future? And so metamodernism really is, okay, we understand that all of these things are narratives, but how can we pragmatically harness these narratives to, and how do we construct values that, are pleasing to us, right? Like, it's a very pragmatic kind of response to postmodernism of like, it's not metamodernism in the sense that it's not so self-serious. So there's a certain kind of, detached irony to it, but there's also like a sincerity to it as well.
Yeah.
Right?
And
this corresponds with and this came out of actually a broader field of metamodernism. And I think you sent me some links from like Seth Abramson.
Yeah, he's got some interesting stuff about it, and it's kind of a hopefulness and a rebuilding.
And it's funny. After I had kind of I had read some of that stuff, and I started tweeting about it and stuff. Somebody reached out to me, and he was saying, "Hey, like I wanted to let you know that there's actually another an older strain of metamodernism that and we actually don't really agree with what the Hansi people are doing." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." So I actually video chatted with them. And we had him on our podcast a while back. What is Metamodernism, I think is the title of that podcast. But,
yeah,
and basically the distinction that they make, I actually don't think the distinction is that important, but they do.
Okay.
But the distinction they make is like, hey, look, we're just observing a shift in the culture that occurred in, like, say, the late 90s or something, when we went in, like, our popular culture, our music went from being kind of really cynical and just really critical. And that was kind of a postmodern thing to a very more like hopeful, kind of, performative, but in a self-aware and kind of, but in a very kind of earnest way type of thing. And it's like, so we're just documenting a shift in the culture, and more what the kind of the Hansi crowd, and Hansi is part of a larger kind of what I call developmental metamodernism. There's other thinkers, and there's vigorous debates that go on between them about stuff. But it's more about, we're not just observing trends. What we have a vision for the future, and so we're trying to enact it in the world. And so it's the difference between kind of just kind of being a chronicler of cultural trends, what I call metamodernism as a cultural sensibility, versus metamodernism as a societal project.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That's fascinating. Okay. So it's kind of a distinction without difference, in your opinion.
Well, it is important, but it's not. I understand why it's important to people. It's just not that important to me.
Right.
Like I really like the metamodernism as a cultural sensibility stuff. But I don't. For me personally, it doesn't really, like, everything, all the content that I've read from that doesn't contradict any of the Hansi content. It just enriches it even more. But I definitely align more with the developmental side, but that's just, I can trace that to my history of being a Baha'i. And, I've always been kind of a utopian at heart, even though these days I'm very skeptical, I like the term relative utopia, because I think absolute utopian thinking is extremely pathological and dangerous, right? But
yeah,
relative utopia is like, can the world be better? Can we systematically cultivate the conditions that a better world can emerge, right? Like, not that we know what it's going to look like from a top-down engineering standpoint, but we can kind of sense the attractor point, that, this is bringing in some terminology from complexity science.
Yeah.
What is wanting to emerge, right? And can we cultivate the conditions to help that along?
Well, exactly. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with being hopeful about it and wanting to do it. It's fascinating. When you consider postmodernism started, a lot of people will consider it started in kind of the post-World War II era, when we saw science doesn't fix everything and it can kill a lot of people.
Right. Exactly.
And it's fascinating that the gung-ho nature of deconstruction, like, humanity didn't know enough about itself to realize that when you tear down the meta-narratives and you have nothing else, people will inject their own meta-narrative. And so we lacked that awareness of self as object. It was like the belief in the rational agent was still there. Yeah. Postmodernism just substituted the belief that we can just thrive off of looking at the dynamic interplay of opposites, and, vis-a-vis Derrida. It's like, we can't survive off that. People need some more concrete stuff. And we didn't realize the theoreticians projected their own Pollyanna sensibilities, in my opinion.
Yeah. And, to be fair to at least the kind of the original postmodern,
which I love,
the French post Derrida and Foucault, is like, and what people of that persuasion have argued to me is that, well, it's actually there in the text, but it's been misinterpreted. Right. And perhaps that's true.
Yeah.
But yeah, going back to, it goes back to, our, discussions I had with, I used to have a lot of like kind of interfaith discussions with Christians and things of that nature. And it goes back to like, well, if everything's, if you say everything is relative, you're saying that's an absolute truth, that everything's relative. Right. So it's like a self-defeating thing. And so you can run into the trap of, well, nothing is true. Everything is just kind of construction. Well, is what you're saying also a construction? So
exactly.
Repeating itself. And so, yeah, there's these kind of inherent contradictions that, are hard to get around.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, again, dialectical thinking, both and the realization of absurdity is inevitable. We have to do that. And I notice overthinkers, like, we have to talk about that capacity to kind of, and I love, again, your Q&A, your Twitter Q&A podcast, you go over the fact that for people that overthink, they need to read an activist literature. They need to get into that stuff, because one thing I'll tell clients like that, I had a client who was so unbelievably wedded to his ideas. It's like, I coined this phrase, I think it was in this session, that you can't think your way out of a bad mood. You have to do your way out of it. And people miss that.
Yeah. No, I really like that. I mean, thinking, can get you a certain distance, right?
Absolutely.
If you need to think about, let's relate it to our current situation with coronavirus, like, making a list, rational thought about, okay, if I'm going to quarantine, how many calories do I need for 2 months? What kind of nutrition do I need? Rational thought is extremely effective for that, right?
Of course.
I'm not gonna dip into my emotions necessarily for that.
Right.
But but that can only take you so far, because part of the Kagan, and this is actually somewhat of a, I don't know if you're familiar with David Chapman, but he's
of course, because he's the one that does the Keegan stuff. You recommended him, and I've started looking at
but and this is kind of his interpretation of Kagan is that and this also relates to, like, I think it's who's incompleteness theorem. It's not Gödel. It's anyway, but it's basically this idea that every rational system is like necessarily incomplete, right? And so you construct this rational system to order your life, but you start noticing that there's cracks and there's kind of contradictions that you try and paper over, or you try and address, but it just becomes more and more obvious, and it starts to break down. And how Chapman interprets Kagan's work is that, kind of this, the stage of nihilism is actually the kind of in-between stage between 4 and 5. It's like a stage 4.5, where your rational system has broken down, and you're like, well, nothing means anything. It's all meaningless, right? Like I had so much faith in this, an example of this is like, say you grew up in a really religious faith and you took it very seriously, and you were studying to become a priest or something, and all of a sudden you started having doubts, right? And like about, whatever theological doubts you're having, and then you go through this phase of like kind of deep depression where you're like, I don't, like I thought I had a system to build on, and now it's gone, and it's like this wasteland. And what Kagan talks about is like, in order, you have to move to the next stage of this kind of meta-rational stage, which he equates with stage 5, where you're able to understand that every system is incomplete. Like as an individual person, like we can't comprehend the whole truth. And so, but many different perspectives, lenses, systems can be useful, can be pragmatic. Right. And so being able to take on a rationalist lens when it's appropriate, or being able to dip into your body and tap into your emotions and empathize with somebody, like sometimes somebody doesn't want you to solve their problem. They just want you to empathize with them. Right. And you can dip into that space, or it could be, competing ideologies, and you're like, well, I can kind of see from that perspective. And it's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Right. But I can also see from this perspective, and that kind of makes sense. And so how do we create this dialectic between these two? Another good analogy or metaphor is the blind monks and the elephant, right? It's like, okay, well, you think you have the whole truth because you've grown up only touching the leg of the elephant, and I grew up touching the trunk, and the other person grew up touching the tail. It's like, no, this is the truth. This is what I know. But, perhaps you need some kind of dialogue across all of these different frameworks in order to start getting a vague but emerging picture of a, perhaps a higher transcendent truth. Right. Right. It's and if you take an evolutionary view, that never ends. Right. Like, it's fractal in a way. Like, it's just like whatever the truth is in here, out there, it's so far beyond what we can, even, it's like we have a pebble of the beach. Right. And so it's just a continuing everlasting process, as long as we're around to engage in that process.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting when you talk about that interplay of rational thought and intuition. to pivot back to that for a minute, like you're reminding me of when people identify with self so much. Like some people, like personality disorders, can emerge from like identifying with like the injured child self and then reacting defensively out of that, and then people see you as an adult because you're an adult, but it's like, well, there's that hurt that's been unresolved. You have to go back to the body for that and realize that you're acting out of that versus what's coming in. It's like, so rational thought has its place. I think mindfulness provides clarity of that. Kind of that helpful supplement to that because personality disorders usually constitute this sort of unresolved acting out of the body and what happened to it and self that's stunted versus what really is going on. And so it's like the way you talk about the self-inquiry, it's to me that I wrote down here the metaphor of like a software update where it brings your inferences up to the present and it sort of clears the cache out, the ones that you're operating on maybe that aren't relevant anymore.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, self-inquiry and mindfulness, at least in how I think of it, is, they're often conceived as kind of separate practices, but I see them as really part of the same practice. And well, I kind of just describe how I think it. So I see mindfulness or meditation, at least, kind of insight meditation is a process of becoming aware and then accepting. Awareness and acceptance. You become aware of, say, some emotion, and you get sensory clarity of it, and you build up concentration, to become aware of it. But then once you become aware of it, you, like, if it's something that's unsettling, you have to kind of accept it, and not just in a rational sense, but you have to accept it in a visceral sense. Right. A good example of this is, the awareness of death, right? Like, meditating on death is a very fruitful practice. I feel like, because, our immediate reaction is to kind of, not think about it, or, try and, develop these kind of abstract thoughts, or, hope for heaven and things like that. But, another approach is to, like, what does it feel like to know, like, what if you were going to die tomorrow? Like, what does that feel like? Like let yourself feel that, and it might be a very kind of physical experience where you actually might need to like move your body, and you might need to like, let yourself, like wave your arms, or, whatever, there's energy that's going to be unlocked, and it's going to move through the body. And the key thing about that is, and this is part of the acceptance part, is that you don't want, like, if there's energy that starts to move in your body, you don't want to shut it down. You want to let it move where it wants to go. Because if you shut it down, it's going to get lodged there, and it's going to create a whole new set of neurosis for you. So that's the danger of not like letting it pass through, not this acceptance process. So where self-inquiry fits into that, at least how I think about it, is that it aids in the process of becoming aware. And so, like, standard mindfulness practice, you kind of just, you notice sensations and thoughts and things like that. And but a big part of this goes back to the self, and like my relationship to my experience, or, like, who is the person that's actually observing, right? And what are the implicit assumptions behind that? And self-inquiry kind of like goes, and if you just do mindfulness, that might start arising, the sense of self, and you can explore that. But where I said it kind of gives you a hack is that, so if you're like meditating and you're feeling your body, and you're noticing, say, the sensation in your hands, an inquiry might be like, what is aware of this? Like, who is aware of this? Where is this awareness coming from? Right. And you just start exploring that in your phenomenology. And for me, usually what happens, you notice these kind of background that are usually in the background sensations associated with a sense of self, the sense of the observer, the sense of the agent. And you notice it as stories, narratives, but you also notice it as sensations. And there might be sensations behind your eyes, in your shoulders, wherever kind of your sense of normal kind of sense of self resides in your body. You start noticing that as well, and you become aware of it, and then you can go through this process of acceptance, and kind of, and so that's how I see the two relating to each other.
Well, that's beautiful. And you're really going to love The Body Keeps the Score, because it gets
I'm going to read that. Other people have recommended it. Yeah.
I mean, the idea of acting out of that observer. So like you're a lot of the times reacting out of something, and it's like you have to let the body move. So what you're describing is a real clinical intervention that comes in handy with trauma therapy. So somatic discharge is what that's called, or somatic micro movements. Like
interesting.
Remembering someone like assaulted you in some capacity. It's like imagining what you wish you had done and doing it and re-encoding that memory as, okay, I'm out of this now. Like shaking it off or shaking it out sounds so passe, but often there's such a core of truth to that. And it's like the pseudo-intellectual interpretation will be, oh, that's a silly truism. It's a silly aphorism. But then when you get back over to true wisdom, it's okay, that phrase of shaking something out, okay, there's real wisdom there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a really intense version of that. And this is, in the kind of Ayurvedic, Vedantic literature is a Kundalini experience, or Kundalini awakening.
Yeah. Kundalini yoga. Yeah.
And that's really kind of an extreme example where you can be doing these practices, and that's why you have to be a little careful. Right. And sometimes if it's getting too intense, you have to slow down, because you can unlock like this contraction in your body that's been holding this trauma or this memory, and it can all of a sudden just release itself, and all of this energy moves, and it can be extremely powerful. And again, the danger with this is if you have this, say rush of energy coming up, coming up your chest or coming up your spine,
right?
If you get scared and you contract again, you're just like, you're not letting that energy process itself. It's getting stuck somewhere else.
Right.
And so that's why, anyway, that's more of I guess maybe an extreme example of what you're describing.
No, it is. I mean, and so I deal with a lot of extreme trauma cases, and there's a lot of different therapeutic interventions for that. And a lot of them, the best ones, in my opinion, draw on mind body, one word or a hyphenated 2 words interaction there, like the mind body system, and not this idea of, okay, just think better. I kind of have a very skeptical and funny, like CBT has a lot of evidence behind it, but even CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, has been distilled into something called behavioral activation therapy, where doing, in spite of how you feel, doing stuff to feel better, and not predicting, okay, I'm not going to feel any better, because that's a false prediction based on your current emotional state. So doing out of doing something and experimenting is the prescription there. And so it's like, even out of cognitive behavior therapy, there's stuff that comes out of it that's way more into jump starting your affective system and a different self. It's like the biggest problem with over intellectualizers is that they tend to think that how they're thinking now is how they're going to continue thinking, because that's still an ego state. That's still a virtual system that's kind of online, but you trust it because it, like you said, there's a huge benefit to cognition. I mean, I definitely understand that. In fact, it was an epiphany for me that sometimes you have to get outside of that to really improve. Like to pivot back to your article about how you were trying to understand people from within their own systems and the kind of neurotic outpouring that created. I mean, that's tough. Talk a little bit about that, because reading that, there's a very apt explanation of it in the article, but I want listeners to hear what you were doing that kind of prompted it, how you were viewing people on their own schema.
Right. Sure. So it's interesting. I think part of it stemmed from growing up in an environment with just very different kind of ideologies, these kind of cross currents that seemed dissonant with each other. And so, for example, so I was starting to take the Baha'i faith very seriously. And then, all of a sudden I started having these experiences where I'd be in a room with, say, some other Baha'is, and I'd start like trying to observe, almost like in a neurotic sense, like how I would view the situation if, say, I was a fundamentalist Christian. Right. And trying to make sense of it from that lens of the world. Right. And what effectively that did is it shut me down. Like it basically, it made me, like, because I was, abstracting so much and trying to take this other lens, I wasn't actually in my body. And so, people would be talking to me and I wouldn't be able to respond in any kind of natural way. Like, and so, but I knew I had to respond. So then I'd be like, okay, all right, I need to smile, and 3, 2, 1. And then I tried to respond how I, rationally think I should. And it just, almost always a disaster. I was a very awkward person for a very long time. Right. Or it wasn't, or just like another friend, like, somebody who I knew had a very kind of specific view of the world. I had this like neurotic need to like understand all these different perspectives, almost at the same time. Right. And it was creating a lot of cognitive dissonance and a lot of it was basically just shutting me down from any of my, connection with my nervous system. Right. And I think, looking back at that now, what my problem was is that, okay, so on one hand, understanding different perspectives is a good thing, but I was doing that decoupled again from being in touch with my embodied cognition. Right. And being like, yes, I understand, that's there, that other framework that, at least I'm projecting from, right? Yeah. But, I'm still here in this context, in this body, as this person, in this right now, and I'm able to, like there was this at some point there's a switch where I can just like be myself. I can just be natural, while at the same time having this kind of awareness of these other perspectives swirling, but it wasn't distracting from, from my just natural sense, and so that, I guess, is the process I went through. But I was having that issue for many, many years, and it was extremely frustrating because as a teenager, I was like, I was having these psychedelic experiences, I was meditating, and I was also very charismatic as a teenager, and all of a sudden, all of that was like gone, and I was like, it was, like I was, so it was almost like I was like seeing this beatific vision of both the world and myself and my role in the world, and all of a sudden, like I was just this awkward, ineffectual, person. So you can understand how frustrating that would be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. That's the burden of the intellectual. Complexity is not always preferable because there's like the so many hypotheticals and so many empathic thought experiments you're running at once. It's like your mental RAM's being exhausted. You got 50 freaking tabs open. Right. And so that tends to exhaust a lot of people. I had extreme cases where people could barely function without overthinking the stuff. And again, the solution is a mixture of, as you've aptly explained to us, mindfulness and self-inquiry, and they're very mutually beneficial. So it's like people have to realize that this sort of hypothetical comprehension, like you can do that in a healthy dose, but just like being self-focused in a healthy dose is okay, but the opposite can lead to ruin. The opposite of being self-focused, being selfless and kind of experimenting in these waters of how others are thinking, it can lead to this like just cacophony of the brain, really. It sounds like just so many different preconceptions of others that you're preconceiving.
Right. Yeah. And, couple this, I think I might have mentioned that this article. So, part of, and I think this is all connected, is part of why I'm bringing it up. But, I came to a certain point where, I was like reading like, Ram Dass, Be Here Now. And I was, I had these like kind of, I kind of had like a savior complex, and I came to this notion at some point that I needed to become very pure. And what that did is it made me extremely neurotic and, very, very prone to guilt complexes. Right. And so you can imagine this stew where I'm like, one, what I've described, trying to have 50 different tabs open, exhausting my RAM of understanding these different perspectives. But two, like, my mind was actively looking for something to feel guilty about. Like if I had like a moment, a few seconds of like, oh, I feel good, my mind would be like, no, there's something wrong. Like you're not, and it was like, oh no, 3 days ago you said something, you gave a wrong impression, or, you did something, sinful or whatever. Right. And it would just like beat me. And basically I couldn't function in kind of a natural sense until I felt like I had, at least somehow either gotten like it was this model of like, constantly whipping yourself on the back for like not, and it got to the point where, I started like my jaw, and this is connecting it to the physical, the physiology sense of like, I went through this phase where there was something that I was feeling particularly guilty about for a couple of years, and I felt it couldn't be resolved. And my jaw started, like the right side of my jaw became extremely tense. And sometimes this tension would go down into my shoulders and sometimes up into my head. And basically it made it so for a couple of years, I couldn't really smile, right? Like I tried to smile, but my jaw was so tense that it wouldn't let me smile. Right. So this is just another example of part of
physiological tension there.
The physiological tension connected to the psychological tension. Right. And that's really what made me so convinced that the mind body system is so integrated. And so it wasn't until I started, again, my meditation practice and exploring all of these ideas and activism and, all of these things, that I started getting the tools to start working through all of these layers of neurosis, really, and, understand their dynamics and being able to process them and stuff. And still things come up where like, I would say are a little bit neurotic, but like, I feel like I have the tools to be able to process them and to, pretty quickly, where something would take a year or two to process now might take a few hours, right?
Absolutely. I would love to hear what you're working on, and like, so it's a good thing to kind of bring up. So you're over in my stomping grounds of kind of the South area.
Yeah. Where are you?
I'm actually in Colorado.
Okay.
Now.
Okay. You're from the South.
I'm a transplant because I'm originally from South Carolina. So you're over there in NC, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I'm in a little town outside of Boone, North Carolina.
What took you there? What took you to this your new digs? You're kind of in a building that's being finished there.
Yeah. So my wife and I, graduated, both got our PhDs, within a year and a half of each other. She a year and a half earlier. And so she was on the job market. And first so she's from Chile or Argentina and then Chile, although her parents moved from somewhere else. So it's a long story there, but, she got a postdoc in Chile, and we thought we were going to be there for maybe a couple of years, but then she got another offer from Appalachian State, which is in Boone, North Carolina. And so we ended up going to Chile for about 5 months. And this was last year.
Right.
And then we landed here, and she's and she landed in this department called Sustainable Development. And it's a very kind of, I don't know, there's a lot of synchronicity because it's also, kind of what they're about and the kind of dialogues they have and practices is very much in line with where I've been waking up to where I see us as society needing to go. And so lately I've really been kind of exploring, what's called like regenerative, like bioregional regeneration, permaculture, basically this idea that, sustainability is one level where it's like, okay, do less bad, but we're getting to the points in our ecological situation where we actually, at least, if the climate models are correct and, also, acidification of the ocean, topsoil loss, biodiversity loss, like so many things are coming to a head that if we don't change our course, the substrate of our society is going to crumble and society is going to crumble with it. And so this idea of regenerative economics or permaculture is not only doing less bad, but actually, hey, humans can actually accelerate the regeneration of biodiversity, and it's not just about that, of course, technology, carbon capture, all these other things I think are part of the picture. But, the whole thing about permaculture is like, it's not only just doing less bad, but like we can actually improve ecosystems, right? And we can do it faster than if humans were not around. And so, so we just moved to this house on this property on 5 acres, and we're basically, we're going to start developing permaculture. So planning, there's a lot to that, which I don't need to get into right now. But I'm also interested in creating kind of new types of economics, right? So kind of leveraging my background in applied economics and supply chains to apply it to kind of new types of economies that really emphasize, restoring landscapes as well as supporting humans.
Wow. That's awesome. So we can look forward to hearing more from you about that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty new in this space because I was coming from an economics frame, and it was more, and lately I just kind of, I've really been moving in a different direction. It's actually kind of full circle because this is kind of where I was at, when I was much younger, and then I became skeptical of it, and I was like, no, actually, like they're all full of shit, and the economists have it right. And now I'm kind of moving back full circle, and I think in a more sophisticated sense.
Nice.
Yeah, this is really the direction I'm going in. And I'm currently teaching actually a couple of sections of a course in principles of sustainable development. And the thing I love about this space is it's incorporating a lot of really interesting stuff, like, systems thinking, complex systems thinking, and
right.
And it's been a lot of fun, connecting this with these larger kind of meta narratives or, movements of metamodernism. And I don't know if you've heard of Game B and these things. And so it's all kind of converging in this spot for me. And so I'm really excited. Like there's, I'm really, if we can, of course, right now we have this current situation, the coronavirus. But I'm really, barring that, I'm really kind of excited about where we're headed and, what we can create in this area. And I really love the Appalachians and Southern Appalachians. Like it's my first time in this area, and I just love the culture, and I've been reading up on the history, and I'm just, I'm in love with this place. So I'm in a very good place right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a good place to go. I see you tweeting a lot of tips on how to grow your own crops. I mean, you tweeted stuff from the Appalachian mental health book, or there's the Appalachian Children, the Challenge of Mental Health. That resonated with me. I looked up where that quote was from. About few areas of the United States in the late 19th century more closely exemplified Thomas Jefferson's vision for a democratic society than did the agricultural communities of the Southern Appalachians. Nowhere did self-sufficient families to dominate the culture. I love that tweet. I was like, where's this from? This is awesome.
Right. Yeah. There's a friend who's in the department who's like a historian of the region, and he's been suggesting a lot of books to me, and I'm starting to gobble them up. It's just, I love it. I want to learn as much as possible. And I mean, it's really interesting in terms of, this kind of regeneration movement, is that because it's so mountainous, it really avoided kind of the large scale monocropping of kind of, our current agricultural model, which, is very productive in a very limited sense, but it's really not internalizing these negative externalities of biodiversity loss, soil loss, also resilience. People are talking about resilience with this coronavirus, but, having, not just producing a lot of calories, but having a diversity of crops and species that are robust, and, diseases come through, it doesn't wipe out the whole crop, right? Because there's so many different interacting elements. And just the topology of this region and the culture that arose out of it was really amenable to, really kind of I think an ethos of small communities that are, one very kind of, families are very kind of self-sufficient, but there's also this culture of mutual aid and, across the community. And it's just kind of a community and economic model that And it's something really from the past that I feel like we really need to rediscover and bring to the future, and figure out how to connect it to larger scale governance, and also the wise use of technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it gets into issues of like anarcho-primitivism and these ideas of like smaller city states and kind of investment in community is kind of the way I see it.
Yeah. I mean, it's the way the distinction I like to make is that we're not going back to the past,
right?
But we are bringing the wisdom of the past in the future. And the model that I like a lot. I don't know if you've heard of fractal localism from Taleb and people like Joe Norman and folks like that, but it's basically like, it's based on one, having, one, I guess my take on it is acknowledging that humans are embedded in the ecosystem. We're not above it. And if we don't realize that soon, we're going to destroy the ecosystem and ourselves. But
right.
Also recognizing, it's kind of it has some similarities to libertarianism, but not quite. It's kind of like the appropriate governance, the appropriate scale, but the governance should be kind of emergent and bottom up, right? From like smaller communities, maybe like Dunbar number level tribes, that kind of model, but, in a modern sense. And, you can still have like international collaboration to address things like climate emissions and refugee crisis and things like that. But this governance shouldn't be authoritarian or top down, but it should rise from these, kind of resilient and quasi self-sufficient smaller communities that can, collaborate at larger scales. And, and the key difference from the past is we have the technology to do that, right? With digital technology, the internet, peer-to-peer technology, like we have ways of being resilient and robust at smaller scales, but collaborating larger scale because of the internet, because of the global brain. And so, and that's a key difference from the past.
Absolutely. So, one of the questions I like to ask guests is, who would you meet if you could meet 3 people living or dead and have them in a room to talk with you?
Oh boy. I remember seeing people asking this question on Twitter, and one of my responses was like, I don't really need to meet anybody. Like I don't know. That might sound like, I don't know, arrogant or something, but it's almost like I'm interested in the ideas of people, but the person to meet over dinner, it's something it's really hard for me to answer. Like I come up with some, ad hoc answers, but
sure.
Like I don't need to meet, Buddha or Jesus or Einstein. Like they're probably fine, like they're probably cool people and, great ideas, but, like, you know what I mean?
I think I get what you're saying. Yeah. You kind of think it would, a lot of the work speaks for itself is what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, let me give a few names just to throw it out there. And I'll probably, think of other people and regret what I said later, but let me think. I think I would like to meet Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith. People describe being in his presence, and it's very transformative. He's a very kind of spiritual figure. That would be interesting. I think I would like to meet Alexander the Great. That would be an interesting experience.
Oh wow, Alexander the Great.
Yeah. Or him. I'm gonna as the same option, him or Genghis Khan. Like I just want to know what these kind of like world historical conquerors are like, just like you're just hanging out with them. That would be interesting. And the third, maybe someone like Alan Watts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, or somebody like that. Maybe like Terrence McKenna, or one of these kind of like 60s kind of psychedelic culture people. Just hanging out, smoking a joint, vibing with them would be pretty cool.
That's awesome. People can find you on Twitter. I'll link to your articles. The article that we talked about, and definitely look forward to more of your podcasts and projects.
Yeah, thanks, man. This was great. I really enjoyed this a lot, and I really enjoyed you bringing in kind of this formal psychological theory, because it's really helpful for me to kind of helps to form some of my pre-existing ideas, and it's really so it's really useful for me.